Hi, 8th graders. I am reading The Seventh Most Important Thing, Chapter 11. So, in Chapter 10, Arthur just got a note from the junk man of the things that he needs to collect. There were 7 things, hence the 7th most important things. He found a grocery cart that was waiting for him at the garage where the junk man told him to start. So, I'm going to read 11. Arthur stood there for a long time, staring at the sign, trying to decide what to do. Snowflakes melted on his head, and his nose ran. Officer Billy had said no excuses, but nobody could expect him to do a crazy job like this, could they? The list didn't even make sense. Collect cardboard, one of the 7 most important things. In what? The world? The universe? Along with coffee cans and foil? No way, he wasn't doing it. So he left the cart right where it was and headed back down the alley, kicking the gravel hard in front of him as he walked. What a joke, he thought. But he had only gone a short distance before his pace began to slow. He thought about having to tell his mother that he'd screwed up again, that he'd given up on his probation sentence before he'd even started it, that he'd quit and come home. He was sure she'd probably start crying, which would make Barbara cry. Then there would be Officer Billy to deal with, and who knows what Officer Billy would do if he was her first kid to screw up. And he'd probably have to face the judge again, and Juvie's bad food, and bad showers, and bad kids. The more he thought about it, the more Arthur knew he couldn't stand to deal with that mess again. Reluctantly, he turned back toward the garage. The cart and list were still there, waiting for him, of course. As Arthur wrapped his fingers around the grimy metal handle of the cart, he tried to tell himself that pushing a rusty grocery cart around the neighborhood wasn't the worst thing that had happened to him in the past few months, or the worst thing that could happen to someone in life. He'd already been through that. He tried to convince himself that maybe this was just a test. Maybe Judge Warner and Officer Billy wanted to find out how he'd react. They probably figured he'd see the stupid list, give up, and go home. Just what we'd expect from a no-good kid like Arthur Owens, they'd say. Arthur started pushing the cart down the gravel alleyway, determined to prove them wrong. Determined to show he would collect a bunch of junk for a crazy old man. Top of 47. 10 minutes later, he couldn't stand the test any longer. The rattling din of the cart was worse than the sound of fingernails on a chalkboard. The jangling noise rang in his ears. It set his teeth on edge and made his head hurt. Plus, after he'd gone only a block, one of the front wheels stuck, wouldn't budge at all. Arthur had to lift the cart halfway off the sidewalk and shove it forward. But instead of going straight, the empty cart veered wildly to the right and tipped over in someone's snowy yard. Wheels spun crazily in the air. He yanked it upright, hauled it back toward the sidewalk. The same wheel stuck again. He kicked it hard, which actually worked. For a minute, Arthur was kind of proud of himself. Maybe he had some of his dad's mechanical talent after all. He started moving down the street. The wheel stuck again. Arthur swore under his breath. He was sure the people who lived in the houses nearby were laughing their heads off as they watched him wrestle the junk man's busted cart a few hundred feet down the block. He noticed one guy standing on his front porch, smoking a cigarette. From the smirk on his face, Arthur could tell he was probably the guy's main entertainment for the morning. Finally, Arthur half-pushed, half-dragged the cart back to Groovy Jim's and shoved it into the alley next to the shop. Nobody had said he had to use the useless thing for his sentence. All he needed was some kind of bag to collect the stuff on his list. He'd asked Groovy Jim. He pushed open the door of the tattoo shop again, got another blast of antiseptic smells and Hawaiian music, tried not to look as angry and frustrated as he left. Hey, kiddo, Groovy Jim looked up from where he was sitting behind the counter, feet up, reading a book. Back again? You found your guy? Arthur shook his head and mumbled. No, he wasn't there. Must have just missed him. Yeah, I guess. Arthur glanced around, trying to come up with a good story. You got any spare bags? He said finally. I'm collecting stuff for a school project. Sure, Groovy Jim pulled his feet off the counter. I've got a couple of burlap ones from the grocer across the street. How many you need? Just one. Then another idea occurred to Arthur. And what about some cans or glass jars? He added, thinking of the 7 most important things. You have anything like that? Groovy Jim nodded. Sure, I'll see what I can find. After Groovy Jim disappeared into the back room, Arthur couldn't help feeling a little guilty for lying to a guy who'd been nice and helpful so far. But how could he tell him that he was collecting garbage because he'd thrown a brick at a person's head, and even worse, that it was a person Groovy Jim knew? Arthur had never been a good liar, not even about silly things like pretending to believe in Santa Claus for Barbara at Christmas. And not when it had to come to serious things like covering up for his dad's drinking sometimes. Christmas. The sudden thought of what they would do for Christmas without his dad hit Arthur like a fist in the stomach. This was the kind of stuff he still couldn't deal with. He'd been in juvie for Thanksgiving, so he hadn't had to face the first holiday without his dad. But how would they get through Christmas? And not just this Christmas either. His dad would be gone every Christmas and every birthday and every holiday from now on, forever. Thinking about it all, Arthur couldn't breathe. Fortunately, the clattering crash of a half-dozen ginger ale cans hitting the floor and rolling in all directions snapped him back to reality. Geez, oh Pete. Groovy Jim glanced helplessly at the cans he dropped on the floor as he came back into the room. Man, sorry about that. After they'd picked up the cans and Groovy Jim added an empty Skippy jar he'd been using as a pencil holder, Arthur forced himself to focus on the 7 most important things. To not think about his dad or the future. All he had to do was to find a few more things to keep the junk man happy, and he'd be done for that Saturday. Only 116 more hours to go. Good luck with your school project, Groovy Jim called out as Arthur left. You should ask Hampton for some stuff if you see him. He's always collecting stuff. Things. Okay, yeah, I will, Arthur said over his shoulder. Yet another lie. That was chapter 11. I'll be back to read chapter 12 soon.